다르게도
All right, all right. All right, so real quick, since we're gonna get into Lucas Vasquez, the Ayllon or Ayllon, all right, we're gonna get a little background on him first, real quick. We're gonna, make sure to add the new information that we've been learning recently about the original colonists, who they were, who are the so-called Spanish, what they have to do with Sephardic Jews and Moors, right? Well, I'm here on Access Genealogy. It says here, free genealogy website. It's gonna go down here, talking about castaways, deserters, refugees, and pirates. All right, remember who's the pirates and all that? So it says here, there's no accurate measure of the number of shipwrecks along the South Atlantic coast and the Gulf of Mexico, but the number must be in the hundreds or even over 8,000. All right, over 8,000 shipwrecks, also not known as how many shipwrecked sailors and passengers survived in North America during the 1500s and 1600s, or how many Sephardic Jews, Muslim Moors, and European Protestants, who's the Protestants? Same people, escaping the Spanish Inquisition, right? Protestants also being persecuted just like Moors and Sephardic Jews, right? Again, if you got my past videos, we know it's most likely the same people. They were the ones actually covertly, right? Secretly being Christians, but they were actually practicing Sephardic Jews or Muslim Moors, really. And they were escaping the Spanish Inquisition, meaning the Catholics, landed on the shores of the present-day southeastern United States. So they're saying nobody really knows how many. So when historians try to tell you, oh, it wasn't that many, it's very insignificant. They don't know that. That's conjecture. Surviving archives, however, do furnish credible evidence of these people settling in the interior of the Southeast, while officially England was only colonizing the coastal regions. Now we're going to get into Ayllon. It says here, San Miguel de Guadalupe colony. Now dodge the hijack on the whitewashed images, all right, with the body snatchers. In 1526, Lucas Vasquez de Ayllon, a wealthy Spanish sugar planter from Hispaniola. Remember, the Sephardic Jews were the ones and the Moors with the sugar plantations. Let's remember my past videos, Nations of the World, and the Sephardic Dutch, and the Huguenots and all these people who were, setting up shop with the sugar plantations in Brazil and all over, Hispaniola personally financed a colonial expedition that contained over 600 colonists, all right? 600 colonists. This is in 1526. Remember, this is way before Roanoke. Historians currently believe that the colony was established on one of the islands at the mouth of the Altamaha River in Georgia, all right, with the Altamaha people. Ayllon either was not competent logistics planner, or he expected to steal what food he needed from neighboring indigenous villages, as was the practice farther south. However, the indigenous peoples along the coast were only part-time agriculturalists. Much of the flat terrain was unsuitable for agriculture, especially on the islands. It says here, while the village was under construction, the 80 Moorish prisoners of war, Moorish, meaning the Catholics had some indentured servants, some persecuted Moors, prisoners of war, not slaves from Africa. This doesn't mean slaves from Africa. These were the Sephardic Moorish people that had been expelled from Spain and Portugal. A lot of them ended up as prisoners of war, who were essentially slaves. They were considered slaves, right? But they were prisoners of war. Moors from Spain and Portugal became increasingly irritable and finally rebelled. Who's rebelling? Moors, not African slaves. Moors from Spain and Portugal. And yeah, Kurimeo, but they still probably came from, no, they didn't. They were been in there for at least from 711 AD, right? That's almost 800 years in that area. And before so-called Moors from Africa got there, there was already Moors or people of dark complexion in Europe already. More and more war. Yeah, more war, yeah. Right, so they became increasingly irritable, and they rebelled. Apparently, with the connivance of neighbor Indians, the Moors went AWOL. So they teamed up with the Indians, right? Who? The Moors. The Moors. The Moors, not African slaves, the Moors. They were never seen or heard from again. What happened to these Moors? that went AWOL. They said, what happened? They were never seen again. Maybe they mixed in with the Indians and became Indians too. Unlike in the Arawak culture, it was the custom of Muskogean provinces to be inclusive. Great sons often ruled over several ethnic groups. Bands of friendly strangers would be assigned to unoccupied lands and incorporated into the province. Therefore, it is quite likely that these Moors settled somewhere within the interior of Georgia and intermarried with the locals, right? Muskogeans originally had no concept of skin color based racism. You understand what they're trying to say? They're trying to say that the Muskogeans were a little lighter. That's why they're saying, because they accepted the Moors, but both people of color, right? Both people of color. That's why they blended right in. That's why they blended right in the Moors with the Muskogeans. All right, this ain't me telling you. This is what I'm trying to tell you. You have two major genealogies. These original settlers, colonists, were colored people from Europe and the indigenous populations that were already here for thousands since creation. Yeah, a true American. All right, so now we're in the book Jews and Muslims in British Colonial America, a genealogical history. All right, great book, a lot of good drop in here, telling us about who were the original colonists. Straight up, Elizabeth Hirschman and Donald Yates, the authors. All right, I'm in this part right here. It's talking about John White's, what he heard about the Spanish having established a mission before, the Roanoke colony. And this is what he says, William B. Crinliness, as a Virginian historian, writes that the documents record that 1 year after the exploration of the peninsula by Verrazano, remember what Verrazano said about the indigenous population here? He said they're like Ethiopians. Their complexion is like an Ethiopian. All of them. Some of them darker, he says. Lucas Vasques de Ayllon, all right, a lawyer and judge of Santo Domingo, obtained a patent from King Carlos Quinto, right? Carlos of Spain, Carlos Quinto, the swarthy man. Carlos Charles V, yeah, Charles V was a so-called black man. Yeah, Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, Carlos Quinto, says he authorized him to explore and plant a settlement on the American mainland. It was in June 1526 that Ayllon set sail, right? Listen to this. This is way before Roanoke, way before. With 3 small vessels from Puerto de la Plata, Santo Domingo, accompanying him were 600 men, women, and children. With sufficient supplies and 150 horses, the Ayllon entered the Chesapeake Bay, which he named Madre de las Aguas, Mother of Waters, and ascending the Guandape, James River, landed at a place he calls St. Michael or San Miguel. St. Michael was the second colony attempted on the mainland of North America after the establishment by Ponce de Leon at Charlotte Harbor, Florida in 1521. The Ayllon soon died of fever, and the settlement passed through a deadly winter marked by plagues, Indian attacks, and a slave insurrection. Not soon afterwards, its savior, Francis Gomez, gathered together the survivors on 2 ships and sailed for Santo Domingo. Only 150 of the 600 original colonists ever reached safely. All right, so a lot of them stayed behind, right? That's what they were saying on the Axis genealogy, where we just came from. We don't know if they died or anything or what happened to them. They could have mixed in, all right? And that's what did happen a lot of the times. All right, so now we go to page 144. It says here, from France to the Carolinas. And it says, we have already mentioned of South Carolina's very early Sephardic Moorish history. South Carolina. Remember my South Carolina video? All right. So if you haven't watched that video, this is the one I'm talking about. It says Sephardic Moorish, Morisco, free people of color, plantation owners of South Carolina, Huguenots, and servitude. All right, it's a great video. Make sure to get this video. You see, as you can see, the book that we're reading right now, Using Muslims in British Colonial America, and some more information, other sources as well. Make sure to get that video if you haven't watched it before. And again, just want to remind you, everybody, if you're new, make sure to go back, try, to catch up on the information, to see what we have already researched and gone over, so we can surf the wave in real time together and go through the journey together. All right, let's go back. So again, we have already made mention of South Carolina's very early Sephardic and Moorish history, very early. In 1526, Lucas Vasques de Ayllon, a prominent settler and sugar grower, on his Hispaniola, set an expedition to North Atlantic coast. The colony of 500 settlers, including Ayllon, landed somewhere on the South Carolina coast, but met with several disasters. A year later, 150 of the colonists managed to straggle back to Hispaniola. The fate of the remaining ones is unknown. They don't know what happened to them. They can't say they all died. We would argue that these settlers were very likely Sephardim and Moors. Sephardim and Moors, because we're about to go read how he brought them slaves and Indians. So he brought up Indians, as well as these people, Sephardic and Moorish people, right? A lot of them were being persecuted and they were looking for a new place, a new home. And he was helping them because he was also a Sephardic Jew. All right, so again, we're gonna read how, first of all, they lied to us, talking about they brought the so-called first slaves in 1619. That's a lie, because we're about to show that this Ayllon supposedly brought his own so-called slaves or Negro slaves, right? A lot of these so-called Negro is what we got to relate to what we're reading right now. Again, could have been an Indian, or it could have been a Sephardic Jew or more. We just read earlier, right, that there was 80 Moors, prisoners of war, that were basically slaves. It told us straight up, basically slaves, but they were actually Moors who were prisoners of war. So we got to dodge the hijack with the information I'm about to read you in the next couple of books. All right. And just go with the flow. At least to the point is that we're going to prove that we're proving so many things today. First of all, that 1619 was not, we already know there was people of color here in America since ancient times. So that's not the first so-called, black people that came, and then regarding the first so-called slaves or servants, that's also false, because again, we got this expedition who we're going to see as we read later on in this video. They were also considered so-called Negros. When you don't know the history that a lot of these are Sephardic or Moors, they leave that out. They just call them so-called Negros or slaves. But we're going to see that they had Caribs and all the other indigenous populations they were bringing up out of these 600. They needed servants too. They needed people to carry the bags and all that. So it's all that. So again, we would argue that these settlers were very likely Sephardim and Moors, as there is little else to justify their being willing to leave the settled prosperity of Spanish Hispaniola to venture to the mosquito-ridden unknown coast of North America, unless the recently arrived Inquisition had caused them to recalculate their odds in a Catholic colony. In 1563, the Frenchmen were aided by Sir John Hawkins, an English privateer. Chapter 1, it says, Ayllon. And remember, John Hawkins was also a Sephardic Jew. He was a privateer or pirate. Who were the pirates? Who had the ships? It says here, Ayllon is a Sephardic surname. All right? Ayllon is Sephardic Jew. These are people of color. That's why I told you, dodge the hijack with the whitewashed images. The settlers named the place where they first made landfall River Jordan, or the Jordan River, present-day Cape Fear River. All right, this is the area. We would advance the same reasoning for Hernando de Soto's a Sephardic surname. De Soto, Hernando de Soto, a Sephardic surname. He's also a Sephardic Jew. Remember Hernando de Soto? We got the video recently, how he went up in the Tolomeco temple. It was full of pearls with all his Moorish soldiers too. Remember, man, they changed the script on us. They gave us these false narratives. And this is the genealogical history of these people. If you really study their families' ancestry, De Soto, Ayllon, what these people really were, you see that these were Sephardic Jews and Muslim Moors, a lot of them. These original Spaniards and colonists. All right, 600-person expedition in 1540 through the southeastern region of North America. So that's when they went to the Tolomeco temple. Remember, he said he couldn't even carry back all those pearls. Even if he had 600 people, there was not enough of them to carry all the pearls that were inside that temple in the same area. See where they are, right? So it might have been somebody wrote back to me, said, hey, it might be in the Savannah River in Georgia. I'm like, yeah, you might be right. So again, I just wanted to come real quick. We're going to go right back to the presentation in that book, Spanish Settlements in early, the 1500s. We're going to go right back to that. And I just wanted to show you guys that Ayllon, because we're going to be talking about him, is not going to mention any of this in those books. It's not going to say nothing about him being Sephardic or him bringing up Moors. That's why I wanted to come here first and get this new information in here, right? So we can get a clearer perspective of who this Ayllon guy and who he might have also in the 600 person crew of his ship, right? Moors and Sephardic Jews trying to escape the Catholics, all right?
All right, so remember, why are we even talking about 1619 and first so-called African slaves when we know in its recorded history that the Spanish, right, the Spanish had settlements in the United States way before the English in 1607, 1619, whenever they brought their so-called slaves. And they have recorded that they also brought up so-called Negroes. All right, so who was first? All right, so we can throw that out the window. What you talking about 400 years? You see, this is all make-believe. All right? So the book is called The Spanish Settlements Within the Present Limits of the United States from 1513 to 1561 by Woodbury Lowery. That says with maps, and this is from 1911. All right, so we're in chapter 2 of this book, and it begins with continuing in the last chapter. It was talking about Ponce de Leon. If you guys don't know, one of the first Spanish colonizers. He actually, made it to Florida. One of the first so-called Spaniards to make it to Florida and discover it, supposedly, right? And some of the islands there, like Bimini and other islands near Florida. So it says here, sterile, as was the result of his expedition in the acquisition of gold and slaves. So he was trying to get gold and slaves because he had heard of the Fountain of Youth and gold and all these legends of Florida. All right, remember Ponce de Leon. All right, and so he wasn't able to because they kept fighting him. They kept, even though they were getting slaughtered by their canyons and guns, they were still fighting them. They weren't able to, penetrate the land. So it says Ponce nonetheless determined to secure possession of his new discovery. Proceeding at once to Spain, he obtained through the influence of his old friend Pedro Núñez de Guzman a second patent, dated September 27, 1514, much more explicit than the first, confirming his title. The patent empowered Ponce to settle the island of Bimini and the island of Florida, an island, that's what they thought it was, I guess, which he had discovered, but that he was first required to reduce the Caribs. He needs to reduce the Caribs before proceeding to make his settlement. The grant ran for 3 years from the date of embarkation, and he was further allowed to employ in the attempt at colonization the vessels and men he led against the Caribs. All right. As soon as there should be no further need of his presence, the patent authorized him to build dwelling houses, towns in the island, such as are built in these kingdoms, and even specified in part the details of their construction. It also renewed the command that no one should seek for slaves within his islands without his consent. So don't come looking for slaves here. Where? In Florida and Bimini? All right, so who was there to enslave? Indians, right? So what were the Spanish doing? Enslaving Indians, not Africans. Why did he have to make a law? Why did he have to tell them, yo, don't come over here to enslave? All right, I'm going to enslave these people. I'm going to make them work. All right, because that's what they were doing at that time. Spanish were enslaving Indians, not Africans. And by the thousands at that time, thousands and thousands. All right, so now look at what Ponce is going to say. All right, and I've been telling you that the Spanish had a type of similar system as indentured servitude. They called encomienda. They had repartimiento, asientos. I mean, they had so many things, but it was just another form of servitude. All right, they had servants. The Indians had servants, an encomienda system, right? They called it. Now he says here, Ponce says, should require of the caciques and Indians in said islands, in the best manner that they could be made to understand that was said to them, in conformity with a requisition which had been drawn up by many learned men, that they should come to the knowledge of our Catholic faith, to obey and serve as they are bounden. And you shall have written down by 2 or 3 scriveners, if they obey, and before as many witnesses and trustworthy persons as shall be there, that it may serve as our justification. And if after the above procedure they seek not to obey the contents of said requisition, in such case you may make war upon them and enslave them. But if they obey, you shall treat them as best you can, and shall seek in every possible way that they be converted to our holy Catholic faith. And if after having once rendered obedience to said requisition, again in Spanish is called requerimiento. Now they're talking about, and I mentioned this in the other videos, that when the Spanish got their Columbus and all of them, they had this kind of they had this document, this legal document they read out. It was called their requerimiento, that they read out to the Indians in their language, right? So they would say, you have to accept, the Catholic Church, you have to accept Jesus and the kingdom and serve the queen and king, and you have to do it, or else we will enslave you and take all your land and your things and everything. And the Indians didn't know. So it was like a game they were playing with them, right? So they can say, oh, well, we told them at least, and they chose war, or like it's saying here, right? So if they disobey, what happens is we should enslave them, right? That's what it says here, right? So this is the requisition or requerimiento. It's called in Spanish. Look it up. They shall rebel. I command that you shall again cause them to comply with the said requisition before making war upon them or doing them any harm or damage. I mean, so eventually Ponce was able to conquer the Caribs and settle in this island, other islands around there in Florida. The whole area they were calling Florida. Even the islands, Bimini and Guadalupe and all that, they were all that calling all Florida. It seems in a lot of these records. All right, so a lot of the Spaniards were doing the same. So there's other accounts. It says here in February of the following year, 1517, Francisco Hernandez de Cordova sailed from Havana with 3 ships and 110 men. Among them were some noblemen who had come to Cuba but a few months before, and a priest to say mass for them and administer the sacraments. Diego Velázquez, at that time governor of Cuba, had sold the adventurers one of the ships on the condition that it should be paid for in slaves, which were to be secured by making war upon the Indians in the Lucayan Islands. All right, not Africans. These once again, the Spaniards were enslaving or putting Indians into servitude, not African. All right, so I just wanted to show you some examples what they were doing. There's a lot of accounts of different Spaniards going on different voyages or expeditions of discovery, right? They were really basically looking for slaves and gold and how to exploit whatever, whoever they found and whatever land or country they landed in America. All right, so now there is one dude that is very important to what I was saying earlier, how they teach us that the first so-called Negroes came in 1619. That was by the English, but that is so wrong. All right, this is a person you probably never heard of in your life. It's a Spaniard, one of those Spaniards. All right, his name was Lucas Vasques de Ayllon. So Ayllon. All right, so it says here, there was living in Hispaniola a certain Lucas Vasques de Ayllon of Toledo, who had come there with Ovando, from whom he received the appointment of alcalde mayor or mayor, right? Mayor of La Concepcion and other towns. He had now become one of the auditors of the island, and he was said to be a man of considerable intelligence, well educated and virtuous, according to the standard of the times, though unlearned in the arts of war, never having done a corselet or borne a sword to earn his wages therewith, says Oviedo, who was personally acquainted with him. He was very rich, having received from Ovando 400 Indians in repartimientos in payment of his salary, as was that time the custom. All right, so what are they talking about? Repartimiento. So the Spaniards, when they took over, settlements, Indian settlements, and they put them and grouped them wherever they had their missions or whatever, then they will distribute them. So repartir in Spanish is to distribute. So repartimiento is like a distribution of the Indians. So he got 400. That's a lot. I have like in my country, this happened in 1569 in Costa Rica, where they put all the Indians in missions because we were living all spread out through the whole country. So they gathered us up and put us in different missions. Once they had us in the missions, they did their repartimientos. And I have a book with the list, the numbers they distributed to each Spaniard or colonist, right? And again, they call it repartimiento, and then it becomes an encomienda. So now you had an indentured servant, right? So this guy had, he got lucky. He got 400 Indians, right? That's a lot of servants, right? Stirred up, no doubt, by reports of kingdoms to be had for the mere asking, Ayllon associated himself with Diego Caballero, clerk of the Audiencia of the island, secured a license for his undertaking, and in 1520 dispatched a caravel from the port of La Plata, having Francisco Gordillo as captain and Alonso Fernandez Sotil as pilot, with directions to sail northward until the continent was reached. All right, so remember, this is in, if you don't know, in Santo Domingo, which is in Hispaniola, Dominican Republic. All right, this is where they're talking about. All right, so it so happened that shortly before the departure of Ayllon's caravel, Juan Ortiz de Matienzo, another auditor of the same island, had sent out a caravel under the command of Pedro de Quechos in search of Caribs. All right, in search of what? Caribs to sell as slaves. Caribs to sell as slaves. All right, not Africans. You see, they're putting all their time and effort, all their charters, everything they're being financed from their Spanish king and queen. All right. So look what they're enslaving. All right. Look where they're doing it. They're doing it here. What? Again, they're in search of Caribs to sell as slaves in virtue of the general license of October 30, 1503. That's what I was just talking about. All right. So a license to basically enslave Carib Indians, right? Not Africans, Carib Indians. In this traffic, the auditor's name did not openly appear, having failed to secure the intended cargo. Quechos' caravel was returning home when, in the neighborhood of the island of Lucayonic, it fell with Ayllon's vessel, which apparently had been cruising about for several months on errands of which no account remains. So these errands, I wonder what they were. Were they enslaving American Indians? Is that what these errands were? That is not, there's no account of. Here the two commanders exchanged advices, and Quechos finally decided to sail with Gordillo for the mainland, intending, as it subsequently appeared, to fill his empty hold with slaves to go get Caribs, all right? So he joined up and to go to the mainland. They're talking about North America, the United States, like Florida and Louisiana, all these places, the mainland. To get what? To fill his empty hold with slaves, to get slaves. They ain't trying to colonize, they're going up there to get slaves. Sailing slowly northward for 8 or 9 days, or as some report, driven by stress of weather, in June of the year following Gordillo's departure in 1521, the two caravels came upon the continent in latitude 33 degrees 30, according to Quechos' testimony, at the mouth of a considerable river to which the name of St. John the Baptist was given, because of its discovery on the feast day of the saint. The Indians appear to have called the country Chicora, and it lay perhaps somewhere in the vicinity of Cape Fear. 20 men were sent ashore in the boats to secure the goodwill of the natives, the necessity of which Ayllon had impressed upon his commander, while the ship sought to enter the river. We're at this website called thehistorynewsnetwork.org. It says from Columbia College in Arts of Sciences, the George Washington University, the forgotten first attempt to plant a colony on U.S. soil. And this is going to correlate with what we just actually read in the book. We're going to go back to it, but I just wanted to show you. That says in June 1526, Lucas Vasques de Ayllon, a wealthy Spanish official in the city of Santo Domingo, Hispaniola, founded a colony near the mouth of the Petey River in eastern South Carolina. This is what we're talking about. He just sent Gordillo, where he just came back from. 6 decades before Roanoke Island, 1587, 8 decades before Jamestown, 1607, and almost a century before the Mayflower landed at Plymouth Rock in 1620, century, 100 years before, Ayllon began his North American dream. Ayllon's effort has been overlooked, perhaps because most people prefer to believe that the U.S. life began with the arrival of English-speaking Anglo-Saxons living under the British law. Perhaps its settlement is neglected because of its tragic fate, death by mismanagement, disease, and slave revolt. Perhaps it is unmentioned because of its unique rebirth in the woods, by people not considered a worthy part of the U.S. heritage. Ayllon prepared for his great adventure in 1520 by sending Captain Francisco Gordillo, that's what we just read about in the other book, to locate a good landing site and build friendly relations with the local inhabitants. The captain instead teamed up with a slave hunter, Pedro de Quechos. You hear this? That's the other guy in the book, right? And Quechos, remember, had a license to enslave Carib Indians. It was a license he was given. It's not that he was just a slave hunter. He was given a license by the king. While failing to survey a site or build good relations with anyone, the two men captured 17 Native Americans. Captured who? 17 Native Americans, not Africans, and brought them back to Santo Domingo as slaves. The first European act on what is now U.S. soil was making slaves of free men and women. Again, the first European act on what is now U.S. soil, the first act ever by any European and American in the United States, all right, was making slaves of free men and women. The two adventurers returned to Ayllon with enchanting tales of naming a great river in the honor of Saint John the Baptist. You see, that's the river we just heard about, and cutting Christian crosses and trees. Ayllon was not impressed with their seizure of 70 Native Americans and brought the issue to the attention of a commission presided over by Diego Columbus. The Indians were declared free and ordered returned, but Spanish records do not show whether the order was carried out, so we don't know if they were returned. We're going to get into the other book again. We're going to go back to the historic accounts, but they do not show that Ayllon, to make amends with the natives who lost their loved ones, sent back the slaver Quejos, who started the problem. Once again, Quejos returned with other captured natives. He this time claimed volunteered to serve as guides for the Spain's expedition. So he sent them back, I guess, to get captured or something. I don't know why he sent them back. I guess he came back with more slaves, talking about they volunteered. Ayllon also retained one of the original 70, which he named Ferdinand Chicorana. He kept one of them as his New World interpreter. Impressed with his skills and knowledge of the mainland, he brought Chicorana to Spain to meet the king. After this meeting, King Ferdinand issued an order permitting Ayllon to sail for the coast of North America. The king's orders forbade enslavement of Indians and added, "You be very careful about the treatment of the Indians." 3 Dominican missionaries were sent to protect Native Americans from Europeans. With this record as backdrop, Ayllon prepared to launch his expedition to North America. After some delays, his fleet of 6 vessels sailed from Puerto de la Plata. Aboard were 500 Spanish men and women, 100 enslaved Africans. Wait a minute. What are we talking about? 1526, right? Wait. But you told us, right? This is from the George Washington University, Columbia Colleges of Arts and Sciences, right? What are they telling us here? I mean, we're going to read it in the other book, but we're going to see who they really were, if they were really Africans, right? But what are they telling us? That they brought 100 enslaved Africans. So I thought it was in 1619 that the first so-called enslaved Africans arrived in North America or United States. You see what I'm trying to show you, right? How it's all a lie. It's just like a movie. It's like a script they're giving you, right? They declared that the first so-called. They wanted that as a reference point, a starting point for some reason. But you can see that this expedition of Ayllon in 1526 to South Carolina brought with him 100 enslaved Negros, which they're calling Africans here. I mean, these characters, these Spaniards we're talking about in the book we're reading right now, I don't see no accounts of them enslaving Africans anywhere, going or buying any Africans in their records. All over their records, all these Spaniards are enslaving American Indians. All right? So, first of all, there's a lot of lies in there. A lot of things to unveil, a lot of layers, right? You see what I'm showing you, right? So, first of all, it's not Africans. And second, this is way before 1619, almost 100 years before. 100 years. All right? All right, real quick, we're in this other book. It's called Lucas Vasques, the Ayllon's Doomed Colony of San Miguel de Gualdape. This is from the Georgia Historical Quarterly, I guess volume 85. All right, so it says here following Ponce de Leon's abortive 1521 attempt to establish a colony on the west coast of the peninsula of La Florida, Lucas Vasquez de Ayllon led a Spanish expedition that intended to found a colony in La Florida. But far north of Ponce de Leon's site, Ayllon was spurred on in this endeavor by the report of Captain Pedro de Salazar, a slave trader who happened upon a new and undiscovered land northwest of the Bahamas sometime between 1514 and 1516. Salazar spoke favorably on the desirability of the land itself and also brought back Indians. Brought back who? Indians, a slave, right? A slave trader. What was he trading? Or who was he enslaving? Indians of giant stature who commanded a high price in Española, which he was selling in Santo Domingo, Hispaniola, in the West Indies. All right, he was grabbing Indians from North America, bringing them to Hispaniola. He was a slave trader again. All right, so who were they slaving? They enslaving Africans. Based on Salazar's report, Ayllon sent an able navigator, Francisco Gordillo, in search of his utopian land, peopled by giant Indians. Gordillo was joined by a fellow pilot in another vessel, and the two ships departed Great Abaco Island on a northerly course in search of Salazar's reported discovery. They sailed north for an estimated 110 to 115 leagues. All right. When their soundings indicated they were near land, consequently, they turned west to seek the shore. On June 24, 1521, a day after the feast of St. John the Baptist, the two navigators found land and anchored in the river, which they appropriately named the Jordan River. The Jordan River, because of the association with John the Baptist. The distance north of the Bahamas, together with the description of the river by Pedro Martir, and his decades, would place the Jordan River as the wide and deep Wakama River. The Wakama. You guys know this area. This is where they're talking about. Emptied into Winya Bay, just south of Myrtle Beach in South Carolina. However, historian Polly Hoffman identified the Jordan River with the small Santee River south of Winya Bay. The shallow Santee River seems an unlikely choice, as it flows through a large uninhabited tidal swamp area that could not have accommodated the large Spanish vessels, nor supported the Indian villages reported at the site. Martir's description of the Jordan River fits the Wakama better and reads, it extends a great distance in the same direction as the land where the Spanish anchored. The first Indian districts were called Chicorana, Chakori. Do you guys know about the Chakori tribe? Big up a new breed for letting me know about the Chakori tribe and their history. And Duhare, the Spanish name Chicora, subsequently applied to the general area, apparently came from the Indian tribe named Chakori. So are these the people they were enslaving, these tall Indians they were bringing back to Hispaniola? Gordillo and Quejo stayed in the area for nearly a month, trading with the friendly natives, who Martir asserted were indeed taller than the Indians of the islands, and explored a short distance north, south, and inland from their anchorage. All right. The site of Chicora later, 1526, became the location of Ayllon's first attempt to settle and found a colony on the eastern seaboard. During this time, Gordillo performed the required ritual ceremony as instructed and claimed the land in the name of his sponsor, Lucas Vasques de Ayllon. This act infuriated Quejo, who promptly performed the same ceremony and took possession of the land for his sponsor, Ortiz de Urrutia. At a later time, the legality of who had valid territorial rights to the region was the subject of extended litigation in the courts between Ayllon and Urrutia. Ayllon won out in the end more by default than by action of the court. In the latter part of July, Gordillo and Quejo returned to Santo Domingo with 60 tall Indians, slaves. All right, so they returned. This is the same account. I guess it said 60 here, they said 70 over there, and glowing reports of the area around the Jordan River. All right, so these were the Chakori, maybe they were enslaving, the Chakori that you don't know about. This was the start of the Chicora legend, later embellished by Ayllon in the prolific writings of Martir. They described Chicora as utopian land that did not require military conquest and could easily become a new Andalusia when colonized. You hear that? In the fall of 1521, Ayllon set about laying the groundwork to obtain permission and contract with the crown for establishing the colony. Martir's detailed account indicates that through political maneuvering, Ayllon had obtained the license for the discovery and settlement of Chicora in midsummer 1523. All right, so continuing in the book, here it says, Quejo's voyage set the stage for Ayllon to launch his plan to put a settlement on La Florida at Chicora. Ayllon's colonizing expedition consisted of 6 ships and around 600 persons, including women and children, and a number of black slaves. Oh, all right. So you see how the website over there had African slaves? Now we got black slaves, so-called black slaves. These are just American Indians they're talking about. There were a few priests in the company, but no soldiers. This was to be a peaceful encounter with the friendly Indians, who were supposedly ready for conversion to Christianity, or at least to live and la policia as good neighbors under their own rulers. All right, so very important, right? All right, so dodge the hijack every time you're gonna hear the first so-called African slaves came in 1619. All right, because that's a lie. I just showed you two different sources. Who they bringing down to Hispaniola as slaves to work the plantations? All right, more Indians. All right, in this book we talk about Ayllon's, voyage or expedition, right, to South Carolina, and it says that in the middle of July, 1526. Remember, this is after 1524. And what did we get in 1524? We got Verrazano's account on how he described the Indians he met in La Florida, right, which he said they're basically just like Ethiopians, or as dark as Ethiopians, their skin, their complexion. All right, so 1526, all right, we're talking about the same people in the same area. All right, so he sailed from the port of La Plata on the northern side of the island of Hispaniola with a fleet of 6 vessels and a large boat for tender. His company consisted of 500 men and women, most of them gathered from the islands, whose white population was sensibly depleted by their departure. So he grabbed 500 men and women. I guess it depleted their population in those islands where they were. And he took with them 89 horses in addition to the necessary outfit for the colony. The pilot Quejos again accompanied him. Remember the slave trader Quejos. Among the colonists were a number of Negro slaves. Oh, okay, so we go from African slaves to black slaves. Now we got, in this account, or an original, a primary source actually, Negro slaves, all right? Doesn't say anything about African, Negro slaves. All right. And so what is this proven to us? Again, that so-called Negro or African slaves, or, just any people of dark skin, what you consider a Negro, were brought way before 1619. This is in 1526, almost 100 years before. All right, 1526, we have accounts of Negro slaves being brought. How come they don't teach us this? Why are they always telling us 1619? All right, that's a lie. Didn't you see it's all a made-up lie? It is well to remember that if to Catholic Spain is due the first introduction of Negro slaves, all right, so the Spanish were the first to introduce so-called Negro slaves, not English, in 1619 into the territory of the United States. All right, and one more document here about this colony, and it says here a Spanish settlement in Carolina, 1526, by J.G. Johnson, M.A., University of Georgia. All right. So it continues, says it was not until June 1526 that Ayllon was ready to set out with his colonists. Considering numbers and equipment, it was a more formidable array than that which had already conquered Mexico, or that other which was shortly to overthrow the Inca in Peru. 7 vessels, 600 men and women, among whom were several slaves, and 83 horses made up the expedition. All right, so very important. All right, so we started out in the website remember, with they said African slaves, and then we went to the other book, it said black slaves. All right, and then we went to the other book, the settlements of the Spanish settlements in America, and it told us it was Negro slaves. All right, and now in this article, right, from the Georgia Historical Quarterly, it's just saying slaves, several slaves. All right, it doesn't say Negro, black, African. It just says slaves. It could be anybody. It could be indentured white servants, right? It could be any slave. But we know, right? We know that the Spanish were enslaving or making servants out of the Indians. Remember, this guy alone, Ayllon, was given 400. Remember, we read that already. He was given 400 in the repartimiento, in the distribution, 400 servants or slaves for his own, for him to have alone. They all got a number of servants or slaves to keep with them. Or again, Ayllon had 400 alone. All right, so several slaves came with him. All right, I know, I went through a lot of books and it was a lot of time and information, but I wanted just you to have this in your perspective, that, 1619 was not the beginning of, or the first time so-called Negroes arrived. Negroes were already here since creation, right? American Indians, right? Dodged the hijack with the whole tag they put on you, right? But I wanted to show you how big the lie is. There's so many layers to the lie, right? I mean, there's accounts. We got historic accounts of Ayllon, right? Coming from Haiti, right? Right here. Haiti right over here. The Caribbean, and going all the way up here. South Carolina, where it says Tierra de Ayllon. Look at this map. Tierra de Ayllon. All right? So, I mean, there's a whole history we don't know. Just wanted to cover that. All right? So we can continue.
The English found what they could not accomplish with the torch and the gun, they could accomplish with the stroke of the pen. So that's why they mislabeled our people racially in the records uh, more and more as time went on until eventually there was no Indian presence in the records. There was never that designation. You were identified as mulatto, musty, or any of those other terms rather than Indian.
Sometimes it got to the point where you were even afraid to say that you were Indian. And you told your children not to because it was safer. And so there were just all these different ways of erasing Native people as well as African American people from the cultural landscapes.
At one point in time, it was a bad thing to even say you were Native American. Some people had to lie on their birth certificates and state that they were either black or that they were white. So that definitely had an effect on Native American people.
Native people have become the invisible minority here, particularly in the Northeast. The census takers, who were generally white males, made their decision about who was Indian and who was not Indian. And if you did not look Indian, then you didn't get on the census as being Indian. And so those records, whether it was talking about slavery, whether it was talking about indentured servants, it's like putting a 50 million piece puzzle together.
Northam made a reference to the history of slavery in the Commonwealth during his CBS interview, but he didn't call the first Africans to land on Virginia shores slaves. Take a listen.
Well, it has been a difficult week. And, if you look at Virginia's history, we're now at the 400-year anniversary. Just 90 miles from here, in 1619, the first indentured servants from Africa landed on our shores in Old Point Comfort, what we call now Fort Monroe. And while in 1619, the first indentured servant, the first indentured servant, the first indentured servant, the first indentured servant.
Did comments like that affect his support among Virginians?
So this article is called The Illegal Beginning of American Negro Slavery. Well, it's a magazine, right? This magazine is written from the American Bar Association, volume number 56. This was from January 1970, pages 45 to 49. Nevertheless, those first black arrivals at Jamestown were not enslaved immediately. Rather, they were assimilated into that singular institution known as indentured servitude for a term of years, improvised by the Virginia Company from the child labor laws of Elizabethan England. From 1607 to 1618, the company in London labored to recruit venturesome souls to ship over, but the Jamestown foothold remained tenuous. In 1618, the impoverished company finally hit on a simple method to assure a growing volume of new colonists, privately indentured servants. Under this arrangement, a planter in Virginia would guarantee payment of passage of a new colonist. The recruit would sign an indenture in London, becoming on arrival at Jamestown the indentured servant of the planter for a specific term such as 7 years. The concept of indentured servants in Virginia and the other colonies was thus borrowed from the English poor laws. On arrival at Jamestown, the recruits would be auctioned off to the highest bidder for a specified term by the captain at dockside. This rapidly became the common method of immigration. The rule soon arose in Jamestown and other colonial ports that any person without fare on arrival would simply be auctioned at dockside into indentured servitude. This system, which was practical and economical and legal by custom and usage, was probably considered fair by all concerned given the precedents for indentured labor in England. Alright, so let's continue. It says here, such was the situation when the first 20 Negroes arrived in 1619 as part of a prize taken by piracy from a Spanish ship in the Indies. They were simply indentured for their passage. Again, these first Negroes, right, so-called Negroes, the ones that they tell us were the first African slaves, they were actually taken by piracy from a Spanish ship in the Indies or the Caribbean. And I told you they were coming from Veracruz.
Yeah, so they were pirated off the coast of Veracruz, not Africa. All right, and we're going to end it right here. I just wanted to remind you of this past information. We've gone over this in more detail in past videos, but I just wanted to remind you again. Do you guys see how this is a lie? This is a myth. First of all, there's 100 years, almost 100 years previous, there's a claim that they already had brought so-called blacks. Those might be Indians, those might be black indentured servants from Europe. They're not Africans. You saw there's nothing to prove they were Africans. So that already had debunked the 1619 myth. And on top of that, when you come to learn about the 1619 so-called Negroes, you actually realize they actually were taken from a Spanish ship that was off the coast of Veracruz, Mexico. That ship was coming from South America, and previous to that, from Lisbon, Portugal. It never went to Africa. I want to see the primary source proving these were Africans. They weren't. And they were, in fact, indentured servants. They had contracts. They were freed eventually. They weren't chattel for life. That's a myth, especially in 1619. All right. Again, this was the myth of 1619. I hope you guys see. It's really silly to go ahead and back up that whole false narrative, that whole false history of 1619. There was so-called Negroes or so-called black Indians here since creation. So it wouldn't be the first time so-called Negroes were brought. So that's a whole statement that's missing so much context, all right? It's a whole myth. It has been debunked. I hope you guys see that it's bigger than complexion back then, especially in 1619 and 1520s, in colonial times. They have whitewashed history, and they have reclassified people, turned them into so-called Africans, whether it's American Indians or Black Europeans. Appreciate you guys tuning in all the way to the end. I hope you enjoyed the little review of this information, especially the new people who probably never heard it before. Thank you for sticking around all the way to the end. Appreciate you taking the time to do that. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Again, this has been debunked. It's the myth of 1619. The myth of 1619. Much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Wow.